Naomi Carter, a 16-year-old black student, is publicly humiliated by Officer Grayson, a school resource officer who targets her for her appearance and attitude. Grayson uses his power to shave Naomi's head without consent, claiming it's a lesson in respect. The school's principal, complicit in the officer's actions, does nothing to intervene. This blatant act of racism and abuse of power sparks a fierce fight for justice, led by Naomi's father, Marcus, a civil rights attorney. As they confront the system, the story sheds light on the painful realities of racism in America. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the glass exterior of Westfield Tower, the gleaming headquarters of Darius Calloway's empire. From his office on the 23rd floor, he could see the city spread out beneath him like a tapestry of life, a network of streets and skyscrapers that he had spent years climbing to the top of. He had everything a man could want: wealth, influence, respect. But at that moment, standing at the window, he felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest, a quiet yearning he couldn't quite name. Darius was the kind of man whose presence filled a room without saying a word. His tailored suits, sharp features, and deep voice spoke of success, of battles fought and won in the world of business and philanthropy. Yet, when he looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back at him seemed like someone else. Someone playing a role, carrying the weight of expectations others had for him. He ran a billion-dollar technology firm, advised local government, and had even been a featured guest at international economic summits. Yet his everyday life was far less extravagant than most people assumed. At his core, Darius was a man of quiet humility. He drove a modest black sedan, nothing flashy, and lived in a small, unassuming home on the edge of the city. He wasn't interested in the luxury cars or mansions that others in his position seemed to crave. Instead, he devoted his free time to community projects and mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly from underserved neighborhoods like the one he had grown up in. There, he'd learned what it meant to fight for a seat at the table, and he never forgot the lessons life had taught him. It was late on a Thursday evening when Darius stood at his office window, lost in thought. The gentle hum of city life outside was soothing, but his mind was elsewhere, on a recent conversation he'd had with his sister Simone, the only family left in his life. She'd reminded him of the importance of his roots, of the community that had shaped him. That reminder had lingered with him long after their call ended. It was why, when he stepped into the elevator to head home that evening, he knew it was time to make a stop, time to visit a place that had always been a touchstone for him, a reminder of where it all began. The bell chimed softly as the elevator doors slid open, revealing the polished marble floors and opulent decor of the ground-level lobby. It was a far cry from the part of town where he'd grown up, a reminder of how far he'd come from his modest beginnings. As Darius crossed the lobby, a few heads turned. He was used to it. People always noticed him, whether they recognized him from his company or simply from the magnetic presence he carried. But as he stepped outside, a change in the air hit him. It wasn't just the crispness of the evening breeze or the faint hum of distant traffic. It was the feeling that something was about to shift. He hadn't come to this part of the city in years. The streets that surrounded Westfield Tower were filled with luxury retailers, five-star restaurants, and high-end apartments. But he was about to leave it behind and venture into the heart of the community he'd built his life around. The diner he was headed to was only a few blocks away, a small local spot tucked between a laundromat and an old hardware store. It was called Ella's Place, named after the matriarch who had started the business over 20 years ago. Ella had served coffee and comforted anyone who walked through her door, offering more than just food. She'd given counsel, support, and for many, a safe haven. The warmth of the diner's light spilled out onto the sidewalk as Darius made his way inside, his hand resting lightly on the door handle. He pushed the door open, and the familiar bell above the door jingled softly. Immediately, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon hit him, and the quiet chatter of a few early evening diners filled the space. Ella's Place hadn't changed much since he'd last visited, though the new generation of patrons seemed to have increased. The tables were filled with familiar faces, people he had known growing up, teachers, community leaders, and even a few old friends. Yet, there was one person who caught his eye from the corner of the room. Sitting at the farthest booth, near the window, was a young man who seemed out of place. He wore a well-worn leather jacket, his eyes darting nervously between the few people who were still eating, and the employees behind the counter. Darius couldn't help but notice the air of tension surrounding him. The man's posture was rigid, his hands clasped together tightly on the table. He didn't belong here, or rather, he wasn't used to being here. He looked uncomfortable in his own skin. As Darius moved further into the diner, his eyes lingered on the man for a moment longer before he took a seat at the counter. He wasn't here for any particular reason other than to ground himself again, to reconnect with the real world and not the corporate world he spent his days navigating. It was in moments like this that he truly felt the weight of his success, the contrast between the life he led now and the life he once lived. Ella, the owner, caught sight of him and made her way over, her arms wide in greeting. She was a woman of a certain age now, but her energy hadn't waned. "Well, look who decided to show up. Haven't seen you in ages, Darius. You're a sight for sore eyes," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to turn a few heads in the diner. Darius grinned and rose from his seat to hug her warmly. "Good to see you, Ella. It's been too long." "You're telling me," she laughed, pulling away and placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "The city's been good to you. I see all dressed up in your fancy suit. But I know you're still the same young man who used to work behind this counter, stirring coffee and making people smile." She winked at him, and he smiled back, grateful for the reminder of his roots. "Life's been busy," Darius replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was as rich and comforting as ever. "So, what's got you in this neck of the woods?" Ella asked, settling down on the stool next to him. "Business, or just here to relive the past?" Darius leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "Bit of both, actually, but mostly, just needed to see things clearly again." "Understandable," Ella said. She gave him a knowing look. "The higher you climb, the more out of touch you get. People start to look at you differently, even when you don't change. It's good that you come back every now and then, keeps you grounded." Darius was about to reply when he noticed the young man at the corner booth again. He was fidgeting now, tapping his fingers on the table, his face tight with frustration. There was a tension in the air that Darius couldn't ignore. The man caught his eye, and for a brief moment, they locked gazes. Darius felt a flicker of recognition, not for the man himself, but for the unease he carried. Before Darius could respond, Ella turned her head toward the booth. "That's Jaden. You know his family's been struggling ever since his father passed. He's had a rough time finding his footing around here." The mention of Jaden's name drew Darius's attention even more sharply. He had heard of him through the community, a bright young man who had great potential but was still fighting against the weight of his circumstances. The world had told him time and time again that he was destined for a life of struggle. "Is everything okay?" Darius asked, glancing at Ella. "Hard to say. You know how it is with kids these days. They think the world owes them something, but no one's taught them how to fight for it," she said, her voice quieter now. "Jaden's been making some bad decisions lately, and people are starting to notice there's talk he's been stealing from here." Darius frowned, the weight of the information settling on him. He had been a part of this community, and even though his life had taken a different path, he still felt a responsibility to these people. His mind began to race. Could this be the moment where his past collided with his present? "Let me have a word with him," Darius said softly. Ella gave him a look, hesitant at first, but then nodded. "Just be careful, Darius. You know how people are quick to judge when it comes to kids like him," she warned. As Darius stood up and made his way toward Jaden's booth, the room seemed to quiet down. Every eye turned, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because they saw something in Darius they recognized, a bridge between the old world and the new. This was a moment of tension, a place where personal responsibility, community, and the weight of societal judgment were about to collide. As Darius approached Jaden's booth, he could feel the weight of the room's attention on him. Conversations paused, murmurs bubbling in the air as people waited for what would come next. Some of them recognized him, a well-dressed man with a reputation far beyond this small diner, while others whispered about Jaden's recent behavior. But all eyes were on them now, the young man at the table and the successful businessman who had just approached him. Jaden didn't look up at first, his eyes fixed on the table, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation left by his soda. The jacket he wore was frayed, a few too many stains from late-night escapades, and his face was set in a hardened scowl. His posture screamed defiance, though there was an underlying fear in the way his body seemed to recoil from Darius's presence. "Jaden," Darius said gently, pulling out the chair opposite him. The young man's eyes flicked up briefly before looking away again, his jaw tight with something that seemed like both anger and resignation. "What do you want?" Jaden muttered, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want anyone to hear. Darius gave him a small, reassuring smile, trying to ease the tension. "I just wanted to talk. Ella said you've been having a rough time, and I thought maybe I could help." Jaden snorted, shaking his head as he leaned back in his seat. "Help? You're the guy with the nice suits and the big office, right? I don't need help from someone like you." The words hit Darius with a sharpness he wasn't prepared for. He'd expected resistance, sure, but there was an undertone to Jaden's response that felt loaded with more than just bitterness. It felt like a rejection of everything Darius represented. The system, the society that had cast Jaden aside, was present in that dismissive sneer. "I'm not here to lecture you, Jaden," Darius said quietly. "I know you're going through something difficult, I've been there, but you've got more potential than you think. I want to help you see that." Jaden scoffed and crossed his arms tightly over his chest. "Potential? Yeah, right. You've got everything you could want, don't you? You don't know what it's like, living like I do." Darius let the words hang in the air. He had been born in a similar world, one where opportunities were scarce, where people like him had to fight harder than anyone else just to be seen as worthy. But he couldn't voice that now, not in the face of Jaden's animosity. He had to keep his composure, not let the anger brewing within him come to the surface. Instead, he focused on Jaden. "I didn't start here," Darius said softly, his tone steady but filled with a quiet gravity. "I didn't start in a suit and tie, walking through a fancy office building. I worked my way up, and I'm telling you, there's a way out of this. You don't have to keep living like this. You have choices." Jaden's eyes flickered to Darius, and for a moment, something softer seemed to pass over his face. But then, the defiance returned, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, dropping his voice to a threatening tone. "You think you can just waltz in here and act like you know me? Like you understand? You don't know shit about what I've been through." His fist slammed down onto the table, rattling the silverware. "This ain't your world, Darius. It's not your fight." Darius took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm even as the tension rose. He knew that no matter how much he tried to reason with Jaden, there was only so much he could do in this moment. The anger and frustration, the system that Jaden had been born into, was too deeply ingrained, but Darius couldn't back down. Not now, not with the eyes of the entire diner on them. "I'm not trying to be your enemy, Jaden," Darius said, leaning in a little. "I'm just offering a hand. You don't have to take it, but I'm not going to stop trying to help you." Jaden's face flushed with frustration, but as Darius made his last statement, something shifted. The fire in Jaden's eyes dimmed slightly, replaced by a flicker of something else, something akin to hope, or maybe just the fear of not knowing what else to do. He turned away quickly, hiding the emotion behind a mask of defiance. You don't know what it's like, man," Jaden muttered, his voice quieter now, but still edged with bitterness. "People like you walk around like you've got it all figured out, like you've earned everything, but you don't see what happens to people like me, people who get stuck, people who get ignored." Darius didn't reply right away, giving Jaden the space he needed to let the words settle. It was a painful truth. He knew the weight of the world on Jaden's shoulders, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. He was a man of privilege now, but that didn't mean he'd forgotten where he came from. It didn't mean he didn't understand what it felt like to be treated differently. "I get it," Darius said finally, his voice low. "But this is why I'm here. Not because I think you owe me anything, but because I know that people like you, people like me, we deserve more than what this world tries to hand us." Jaden didn't respond. He simply stood up, pushing the chair back with a squeak. For a moment, Darius thought he might walk away, might storm out and leave the conversation unresolved, but instead, Jaden paused and turned back to him. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. Darius nodded, watching as Jaden disappeared through the door, the tension in the air following him out. The diner returned to its normal hum of activity, but for Darius, the encounter left him unsettled. He had offered his help, his understanding. But the weight of the system that had shaped Jaden's life was far from gone. The challenges of being black in America, of being a successful black man who still had to fight for his place in a world that constantly underestimated him, were not solved in a single conversation. As Darius sat back down at the counter, Ella returned, her face full of concern. "How did it go?" she asked, though her expression already said she knew the answer. "It's complicated," Darius replied, rubbing his temples. "He's angry, I can't blame him, but I can't just give up on him either." Ella's gaze softened, and she leaned in closer. "You're doing the right thing, Darius. You can't fix everything in a day, but you've got to keep trying. Jaden's not the only one who's struggling. There's a lot of people in this city who don't get the chance they deserve. They need people like you to show them what's possible." Darius glanced around the diner again, his thoughts racing. But what if they don't want the help? What if they don't believe it's possible? Ella sighed, pausing before she answered. "Sometimes people can't see a way out because they've never had the chance to. You've got to give them that chance." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air as Darius sat quietly, processing everything that had just happened. The world he inhabited, the world of luxury and success, felt so far removed from the lives of people like Jaden. But he knew, deep down, that the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about giving a hand up. It was about changing the system that kept people like Jaden from ever feeling like they had a choice in the first place. The tension of the night hadn't left him, but a sense of resolve began to form within him. It wasn't enough to change one life. It was about dismantling the prejudices and biases that perpetuated these cycles of anger and hopelessness. But where did he start? Where did anyone begin? As he paid for his coffee and stood up, the uncertainty still hung in the air. But Darius knew that the fight for justice had only just begun, and he was going to make sure it was one worth fighting. The sun had just started to dip behind the skyline of Chicago, casting long shadows across the streets as Darius sat in his car, staring at the courthouse from across the road. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He had been here before, standing on the precipice of a decision that could change everything. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, it wasn't just about his career or his personal ambitions. This time, it was about a young man's future, and the entire community that had been suffering under a system that seemed to be rigged from the start. He had promised Jaden he would be there, that he would help him navigate the system. But as he stared at the courthouse, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just one case. It was a larger battle, a fight against something far deeper than a few bad cops or a couple of misjudgments. It was about a system that was designed to hold people back, to keep them down, and to make sure that only a few ever had the chance to succeed. Darius knew the odds. He had fought his entire life to get to where he was, fought against people who looked at him and saw only the color of his skin, people who had assumed he didn't belong, didn't deserve to be where he was. And yet, here he was, a successful businessman with a platform, a seat at the table. But as he looked at Jaden's face, full of anger and skepticism, he knew this wasn't just about one man or one community. It was about a larger reckoning. Darius's phone buzzed on the dashboard, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced down and saw the name Mitchell on the screen. With a deep sigh, he answered. "Mitchell," Darius said, his voice weary but steady. "You're not going to believe what's happening down here." "Darius," Mitchell's voice came through, urgent and sharp. "I don't care what's happening. I just need you to listen to me. There's something you need to know." Darius leaned forward, sensing the gravity in Mitchell's tone. "What's going on?" "There's a file, a big one," Mitchell continued, his voice low, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "I got my hands on some documents from the department. It's not just one bad officer, Darius. It's the whole damn system. There's evidence of systemic corruption, officers pulling strings, making deals, covering for each other. It goes way beyond just what happened to Jaden." Darius's stomach tightened. The weight of Mitchell's words was undeniable. He had suspected it. He had suspected for months that something wasn't right, but to hear it confirmed made the stakes so much higher. "Are you sure?" Darius asked, his voice tightening. "How much evidence do you have?" "I'm sure," Mitchell replied, his voice firm. "I've got enough to bring them down, But we need to act fast. This information isn't going to stay under wraps for long. The moment this goes public, it's going to be chaos. Darius's mind raced as he processed the information. This wasn't just about Jaden anymore. This was about everything. The corruption, the lies, the abuses of power that had been allowed to fester for years. The power structures that had built their strength on the backs of people like Jaden. People who never had the opportunity to rise above the system that had been set up to keep them down. "I'm on my way," Darius said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We'll expose this. We'll make sure the world knows what's been going on." The call ended abruptly, and Darius shoved his phone back into the pocket of his suit jacket, his fingers clenching around the fabric. He was done being silent. He was done sitting back and letting the injustices pile up. This wasn't just about Jaden anymore. This was about making sure the system couldn't continue to operate unchecked. He started the car and drove toward the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The city's streets seemed to blur past him as his thoughts focused on the task at hand. Mitchell's words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of the responsibility he had taken on, of the fight he was now fully immersed in. When Darius arrived, the courthouse loomed in front of him, its imposing walls a reminder of everything he had fought against. The building was quiet, almost eerily still, as if the weight of the upcoming confrontation had already begun to settle on it. Darius parked and stepped out of his car, his eyes scanning the area as he approached the entrance. He could feel the tension building in the air. This wasn't just a protest or a legal case, this was the breaking point. This was the moment where the truth would come to light, and there would be no going back. As he walked through the courthouse's heavy doors, Darius's mind was already turning over what he had to do. He had to act fast. He had to make sure the public knew what was going on. He had to ensure that Jaden's case wasn't just another statistic, another forgotten moment in a broken system. This wasn't just about one kid getting a raw deal, it was about a community, a people, fighting for their dignity and their rights. He was here to make sure that this wasn't swept under the rug. Inside, the air was thick with whispers. Darius could feel the eyes on him as he made his way through the halls. Some faces were familiar, people he had worked with before, judges, lawyers, and clerks who had always respected him. Others were less friendly, their gazes cold and indifferent. It didn't take long for him to find Mitchell in the back hallway, pacing anxiously in front of a door. When he saw Darius, Mitchell's eyes lit up with urgency. "You ready?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ready," Darius said, his jaw clenched. "Let's do this." The two men moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. Darius could hear his heart in his ears, the tension building as they approached the office where the documents were being held. As they reached the door, Mitchell paused. "Once we go in, there's no turning back, Darius. This isn't going to be easy." "I know," Darius replied, his voice steady. "But it's necessary." Mitchell nodded, unlocking the door and pushing it open. Inside, stacks of files and papers were scattered across the desk, documents filled with evidence of corruption, misconduct, and abuse. Darius's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the first file, flipping it open to see names, dates, and cases that confirmed everything they had suspected. "This is it," Mitchell whispered, "the proof we need." Darius didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was already racing with what to do next. The documents in his hands were the key, but how would they make sure they reached the right people? How would they ensure that the truth came out before the system could silence them? He took a deep breath, steeling himself. There was no time to waste. "Mitchell," Darius said, his voice hardening with resolve, "we need to get this to the press now." Mitchell nodded, his face a mixture of determination and fear. "I've got the contacts, they'll take it, but once it's out there, there's no going back. The department will do everything it can to bury it." "I know," Darius replied, "but we're doing this. For Jaden. For everyone." As they left the office, Darius's heart pounded in his chest. The air around him felt electric, with the knowledge that the moment they'd been preparing for had arrived. The truth was about to come to light, and there was no telling what would happen next. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. The fight for justice had just reached its peak, and everything was about to change. Darius sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face in the darkened office. It was late, but sleep was a distant thought. His mind raced as he scanned the documents Mitchell had managed to secure. Files filled with names, dates, and cases that confirmed everything they had suspected. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, it was a systemic issue. A web of corruption, spanning beyond just law enforcement, was now laid bare before him. And with each document he read, the gravity of their fight grew heavier. Mitchell's voice echoed in his mind from earlier. "We need to get this to the press now." The urgency had never been clearer. The longer they waited, the more time the system had to bury the truth. But Darius also knew the risks. Exposing these documents meant going up against the entire department, against powerful figures who had built careers on silence and complacency. It meant putting everything on the line, not just his career, but his family, his freedom. But it also meant that Jaden's future, along with the future of so many others who had been silenced and overlooked, was at stake. Darius gripped the edge of the desk, his resolve hardening with every passing second. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. There was a knock at the door, and Mitchell stepped into the room. His face was drawn, eyes tired, but there was a fire in them that mirrored Darius's own. "They're already making moves," Mitchell said, his voice low. "Words out. The department's starting to push back. They're already threatening legal action against anyone who talks. They've got their own narrative ready to go, something about it all being a misunderstanding." Darius's fist clenched around the papers in front of him. "A misunderstanding? They're trying to spin this into something it's not. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a cover-up." Mitchell nodded, his gaze flicking to the stack of documents on the desk. "We need to act fast. Once the media gets their hands on this, it's going to be a feeding frenzy. If we do it right, we'll have the leverage to make them listen, but if we don't, we'll lose everything," Darius finished for him. The weight of the moment pressed on his chest. "I know, but we're doing this. We expose them. No more hiding. No more pretending." Mitchell met his eyes, his jaw tightening. "And if they come after us?" "They will," Darius said grimly. "But we've got to be ready for that. We've been fighting this fight for too long to be scared now." The tension in the room was palpable. Darius knew what this could mean. They could lose everything. Money, status, security. The system wasn't built for people like him to succeed, let alone to take it down. But there was no turning back. He had spent his entire life navigating this world, building his reputation from the ground up, and now he was finally in a position to do something about it. He wasn't going to let it slip away. "Call the press," Darius said. "Let's do this." The next morning, Darius stood outside the courthouse, the cool air biting at his skin. It felt like the calm before a storm. Reporters were beginning to gather, their cameras set up at the front entrance, waiting for the moment when the story would finally break. They didn't know yet what they were about to uncover, but they would. Mitchell walked up beside him, his expression focused. "You sure about this?" Darius nodded. "I'm sure we've got one shot at this. We can't back down now." Just as Darius spoke, a car pulled up to the curb, and out stepped a figure he recognized immediately. His heart sank. Officer Daniels. The same officer who had been part of the harassment at the courthouse, the one who had tried to intimidate Darius and his team, the one who was now at the center of the storm. Daniels stood tall, his uniform pristine, but there was something in his posture that betrayed his discomfort. He had always held an air of superiority, but now, as he caught sight of Darius and Mitchell standing by, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something cold, something calculating. "You're not going to let this happen, are you?" Mitchell muttered, his voice tense with barely contained anger. Darius didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Daniels approach, the clack of his boots on the pavement, the only sound breaking the tense silence between them. Daniels was a large man, built like a bulldozer, but Darius knew better than to be intimidated. He had faced down people far more powerful than Daniels. This time, the tables were about to turn. Daniels stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Darius. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone dripping with venom. Darius met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't expect to see you either," he replied coolly. "I thought you might be too busy covering up your mess to show up here today." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, He looked over Darius's shoulder, as if searching for someone else. He knew the media would be here soon. He was stalling, hoping Darius would back down, but Darius wasn't going anywhere. Mitchell stepped forward, clearly itching for a confrontation. "You're not going to get away with this, Daniels," he said, his voice hard. "People are going to know the truth about what you and your department have been up to. There's nowhere to hide now." Daniels' eyes flickered with something Darius couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe fear, probably. "You think you can take down the whole department?" Daniels sneered. "You're just one man. You don't know what you're up against." Darius's expression hardened. "I've been up against worse, and I don't care who you think you are or what power you think you hold. The truth is coming, and it's bigger than you, so you might want to make yourself scarce while you still can." Daniel's face reddened, and for a moment, Darius thought he might try to make a move, might try to grab him or escalate things further. But instead, Daniels took a step back, his eyes flicking toward the reporters who had begun to gather at the entrance, their cameras now focused on him. "I don't need to listen to this," Daniels muttered, turning on his heel and striding away, leaving Darius standing there, staring after him. Mitchell let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's it? He's just walking away?" Darius didn't answer at first. He wasn't surprised by Daniels's reaction, but the implications were clear. This wasn't going to be easy. The system was going to fight back, and they would stop at nothing to protect their own. But Darius was ready. His resolve had never been clearer. He was going to expose everything. The press conference started moments later, the media crowd buzzing with excitement as Darius took the stage, flanked by Mitchell and his team. The room fell into a hush as he stepped forward to the podium. Darius adjusted the microphone, his fingers briefly brushing against the metal, and then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you not just as a businessman, but as someone who has spent his entire life fighting for justice," he began, his voice strong and commanding. "But today, we are not here to talk about one individual or one isolated incident. Today, we are here to talk about a system that has allowed corruption, abuse, and bias to run rampant for far too long." The room was still as Darius's words echoed in the silence. The journalists were listening intently, their pens poised to capture every word. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but it didn't deter him. If anything, it fueled his resolve. "Officer Daniels is only the tip of the iceberg," Darius continued. "What's been happening in this department, and in others across the country, is a pattern of systemic corruption, a pattern that has been ignored for years, because those in power believe they are untouchable." The tension in the room thickened, the gravity of Darius's words settling over the crowd like a heavy weight. He knew this was the moment. This was where everything changed. "I have the evidence," Darius declared, holding up the files he had brought with him. "And I'm not backing down. This fight is just beginning." As he spoke, the door behind him opened, and a familiar face walked in. Officer Daniels. His presence an ominous shadow. The crowd fell silent, but Darius stood tall, ready for whatever came next. What would Daniels do? What would the system do in response? The question hung in the air, unanswered. And with that, the story was on the brink of something much bigger, much more dangerous than either of them had ever anticipated. Darius stood at the front of the crowded press room, his heart racing with a mixture of determination and the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The cameras were trained on him, the audience silent, hanging on every word. He could feel the pressure. His decision to expose the corruption in the system had become a lightning rod, and now the storm was here. Officer Daniels had just walked in, his presence cutting through the room like a blade. His posture was stiff, shoulders squared, and despite his earlier retreat, there was a new air about him, a mixture of arrogance and defiance. Darius didn't flinch as the officer's eyes locked onto his, each man sizing up the other. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a clean, calm discussion. Daniels was here for a confrontation. "Mr. Harris," Officer Daniels said, his voice low and controlled, "you think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think you can just tear down everything we've built here?" Darius didn't give an inch. His eyes didn't leave Daniels, but his voice remained even, commanding. "What I think is that this system was never meant to protect people like me. It was designed to keep people like you in power and people like me silent. You've spent years abusing that power, hiding behind your badge, and now that it's coming to light, you want to pretend like you're innocent? Daniels's expression tightened, his jaw clenched, as if Darius had struck a nerve. The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. But Daniels wasn't backing down. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Daniels said, stepping closer to Darius, his tone menacing now. "You're just a disgruntled nobody trying to play hero, to turn yourself into something you're not. You think your little investigation is going to change anything? You think people are going to believe you over me?" Darius didn't move, his stance steady, his resolve growing stronger by the second. "It's not just me they'll believe, it's the truth, and the truth doesn't care about your badge, Daniels. It doesn't care about your reputation. It cares about what's right." The tension between them was palpable, each word a spark that threatened to ignite an inferno. Darius's mind raced through the evidence he had, the case they had built. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice, he was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for every person who had been overlooked and disregarded by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Daniels's eyes narrowed, his frustration now bubbling over. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a man with a grudge, trying to tear down everything we've worked for. You're nothing compared to what I've sacrificed for this department." Darius could hear the thinly veiled desperation in Daniels's voice. He wasn't just defending his actions, he was defending his entire identity, but Darius saw right through it. This wasn't about Daniels's sacrifice, it was about maintaining control, about keeping the system running the way it always had, no matter the cost. "You're right about one thing," Darius said, his voice sharp. "You have sacrificed. You've sacrificed integrity. You've sacrificed justice. You've sacrificed the trust of the people you swore to protect. And for what power?" Daniels's face twisted with anger. "You don't know what it's like to be out there, to make the hard decisions. You've never had to make choices like I have. You've never had to protect people who don't care about the rules, who don't care about respect. You wouldn't understand." Darius's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He was no stranger to the biases, the assumptions, the prejudice that people like Daniels carried with them every day. The idea that his blackness made him lesser, that his place in the world was somehow determined by his skin. He had lived with that every day of his life. But now was the time to fight back. "I understand more than you think," Darius said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "I understand that the people you've been hurting, people like me, are tired. We're tired of being dismissed, of being treated like we don't matter. But what I'm about to do is not just about me. It's about all of us. All of us who've had to fight for our voices to be heard." A murmur rippled through the room, the reporters leaning forward, sensing the intensity of the exchange. Daniels glanced around, his eyes darting from Darius to the cameras, his discomfort growing as the pressure mounted. "You're making a mistake," Daniels hissed, his tone low and threatening. "You think you're above this, above the system. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." Darius leaned forward slightly, his gaze unrelenting. "No, Daniels, this is about what's right, and it's about time people like you were held accountable for the damage you've done." A long silence followed. For the first time, Daniels looked uncertain. His bravado, his confidence, faltered. Darius could see it. The realization that he wasn't in control anymore, that the tide was turning. But then, just as quickly, Daniels's demeanor shifted again. He squared his shoulders and took a step back, his smirk returning. But it was a hollow thing now, masking the fear that was creeping in. He was playing the game, trying to regain control, but it was clear that Darius had already won the first round. "You won't get away with this," Daniel spat, his voice barely contained. "You think you can just bring me down with your little press conference and your documents? You think that's going to change anything? You think people will listen to you over me?" The question was rhetorical, but it landed heavily in the room. The weight of Daniels's words hung in the air for a moment, like a challenge. But Darius knew what was coming next. He had prepared for this moment. He knew Daniels would try to discredit him, undermine his credibility. He had spent his whole life navigating systems that were stacked against him, and now, it was his turn to use that experience to fight back. I don't need to make anyone believe me, Daniels, Darius said, his voice unwavering. I have the truth, and the truth doesn't need your approval. The room seemed to hold its breath. Darius had spoken with clarity, with purpose, and Daniels knew it. He had pushed back, tried to rattle Darius, but now it was clear who had the upper hand. You're right, Daniels muttered under his breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as the pressure of the situation weighed down on him. This isn't over. Darius smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of a man who knew that victory wasn't about winning the battle, it was about forcing change. And as Daniels turned and walked out of the room, Darius's heart pounded with the realization that this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over, but in that moment he had taken a stand, and that was something the system couldn't erase. The room began to stir, the reporters whispering among themselves, their cameras still trained on Darius as he stepped away from the podium. Mitchell joined him, his face a mixture of relief and concern. You did it, Mitchell said quietly. But this is just the start. The real fight starts now. Darius nodded, his gaze unwavering as he walked toward the exit. I know, but at least now, they can't pretend it's not happening. As Darius stepped out of the room, the weight of the moment settled over him. He had made his stand, but the storm was only beginning. The system would fight back, they always did, but he was ready, and no matter what happened next, he knew he couldn't stop now. Darius stepped into the courtroom, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick fog of anticipation that made his every step feel heavy. The room was crowded with reporters, colleagues, and strangers, who had all come to see the unfolding drama. The battle between a man who had spent years hiding behind his badge, and the man determined to expose him for what he truly was. Officer Daniels sat across the room, his eyes hard and cold, a barely perceptible sneer on his lips. The years of power, of being unchallenged in his position, had given him a dangerous sense of invulnerability. Darius could feel it in the way Daniels looked at him, like a predator sizing up its prey. He had seen the officer's arrogance before, in the way he had treated so many people like Darius, people who had dared to stand up, to challenge the system. But now, it was Darius's turn to stand tall. He had prepared for this moment, gathered the evidence, and gone through every possible scenario in his mind. Now, it was time to confront the man who had caused so much pain, to make him answer for his actions. As Darius walked to the podium, he could feel the eyes of the room on him. The moment had arrived. He took a deep breath and began, his voice steady, but laced with an intensity that commanded attention. Officer Daniels, he said, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. You've spent your entire career hiding behind your badge. You've used your power to hurt people, to crush them under the weight of your prejudice. But today, that ends. Today, you will be held accountable for every life you've affected. The room fell silent. The murmurs from the crowd stopped, and for a brief moment, even Officer Daniels seemed to hesitate. But that hesitation didn't last long. He straightened in his chair, his face hardening as he stood, towering over Darius. You think you can intimidate me? Daniels's voice was low, cold. You think you've got all the answers? You think your little investigation is going to change anything? You're just another angry man trying to take down someone who's been doing their job, who's been trying to keep order in a world that's falling apart. Darius met his gaze head-on, his jaw tightening with the weight of Daniel's words. This wasn't about doing his job. This wasn't about order. It was about control. It was about maintaining the power dynamics that had always existed. I'm not here to take you down, Daniels, Darius said, his voice calm, but each word cutting like a knife. I'm here to expose the truth. You've been abusing your position for years, hiding behind your badge, and pretending like no one would ever notice. But today, I'm bringing everything to light. Daniels sneered. You're nothing but a pawn in a bigger game. You think you're special, that your voice matters. I've seen men like you come and go, and nothing ever changes. You're just one more man with a grudge, trying to tear down everything we've built. Darius felt his heart rate increase, but his composure never wavered. This was the moment. The moment to show everyone what Daniels really was. An abuser of power, a man who hid behind authority to hurt people, to make them afraid Darius had spent his entire life fighting for equality, for justice. He wasn't going to stop now. "You're wrong," Darius said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You are nothing but a coward who uses your position to intimidate and humiliate. You don't fight for justice. You fight to protect your own arrogance, your own fear, and that fear, it's what's going to bring you down." Daniels took a step forward, his posture shifting as if he were preparing for a confrontation. But Darius didn't flinch. He stood his ground, every fiber of his being focused on this moment. He was ready to fight for what was right, even if it meant taking down a man who had spent years in a position of power. "You want to play hero?" Daniels spat, his words sharp and venomous. "You're nothing but a fool. I've seen men like you try to bring us down before, but we always win in the end. You'll be nothing but a footnote in the story, forgotten by the time the dust settles." Darius's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You'll never win. Not this time, not with the truth on my side." The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. Every word Darius spoke was like a hammer, pounding at the walls that Daniels had built around himself. But the officer wasn't done yet. He wasn't ready to back down. He needed to assert his dominance, to remind everyone that he was still in control. "You think you have the truth?" Daniels laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. "The truth is subjective. The truth is what I say it is, and people will believe me over you every time." Darius didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. The deflection, the lies, the manipulation. But now, it wasn't about convincing Daniels. It was about exposing him to everyone in the room, to everyone who had been complicit in the system he had created. This wasn't just about one man's arrogance. It was about the entire system of injustice that allowed men like Daniels to thrive. "Not this time," Darius said, his voice firm. "You've been hiding behind your badge for too long, Daniels. But now the truth is coming out, and when it does, there's no way to escape it." The silence in the room stretched on, each second an eternity. It felt as though the weight of the entire world was on Darius's shoulders. But his resolve never wavered. He had made it this far. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Daniels took another step forward, his face reddening with anger. "You really think this is over, don't you? You think that after all this, you're going to walk away with your head held high. You'll be crushed. The system will crush you, just like it crushes everyone else." Darius's heart raced, but his voice remained calm, steady. "I'm not walking away, Daniels. I'm staying here, and I'm fighting for what's right, and I won't stop until you're held accountable for everything you've done." Daniels' jaw tightened, and for the first time, Darius saw a flicker of fear in the officer's eyes. This wasn't the same man who had walked into the room with arrogance. This was a man on the verge of losing everything. The game had changed, and he knew it. "You'll regret this," Daniels hissed, his voice low and filled with venom. "You think you can take me down? You have no idea what you're up against." Darius's gaze hardened, his stance unwavering. "I've been up against the system my entire life, Daniels, but this time, you're the one who's going to fall." With that, the room erupted into murmurs. The audience, the reporters, the colleagues, they all understood what had just happened. Darius had not only held his ground, but he had exposed Daniels for who he really was. A man blinded by his own power, someone who was willing to destroy lives to protect his position. Daniels's facade was crumbling, and he knew it. But it was too late. The truth had already been revealed. As Daniels stormed out of the room, his face contorted with rage, Darius stayed behind. His heart pounded, but he didn't move. The battle wasn't over. The war had just begun, but in that moment, he had made his stand, and the world had seen it. The audience remained quiet for a long moment. But then, slowly, the murmurs began to rise. They weren't just speaking of Darius's strength. They were speaking of their own. His stand was their stand. His fight was theirs too. Darius turned to leave, but before he could exit, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Mitchell standing behind him, his face a mix of awe and concern. "You're not done yet," Mitchell said quietly, his voice filled with respect. Darius nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Not by a long shot. But as he walked out of the courtroom, Darius couldn't help but wonder, how much longer would it take before the system that had protected men like Daniels finally came crashing down? With everything on the line, there was only one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't going to stop fighting now. Darius stood outside the courtroom, his mind still racing from the confrontation. The tension in the room had been thick, but now, as the doors closed behind him, it felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he took a deep breath that didn't feel heavy with fear or doubt. He had done it. He had exposed the truth. And now, it was time for the system to answer. As the crowd dispersed, murmurs filled the air. Darius could hear the buzz of reporters in the hallway, the cameras clicking, capturing every moment. His mind raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. Officer Daniels, the man who had once carried himself with such arrogance, now had nowhere to hide. The words Darius had spoken had shattered his facade, revealing the truth of his actions. The officer's arrogance had faltered. The world had seen him for what he truly was, a bully, a man who had used his badge as a weapon against the vulnerable. In the days that followed, the consequences of that confrontation began to unfold. Daniels's once untouchable reputation quickly crumbled. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the investigation into his actions snowballed. Darius's testimony had been the tipping point, but it was the flood of support from the community and the public that kept the pressure on. People were speaking out, from local residents to civil rights activists. The truth had been spoken, and now, everyone wanted justice. The following morning, Darius sat in his office, watching the television. As the news stations reported on the latest developments, Officer Daniels had been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. The police department was facing intense scrutiny. Internal Affairs had launched a full investigation into the officer's actions. And in a statement released to the media, the mayor vowed that any officer found guilty of misconduct would be held accountable. Darius didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. He had spent so many years fighting against systems that were set up to protect people like Officer Daniels. The road to change was long and fraught with setbacks, but today felt different. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was winning, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by systems of power. "Darius!" Mitchell's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see his friend standing at the door. Mitchell's face was serious, but there was a spark of admiration in his eyes. "You did it, man! You really did it!" Darius smiled faintly, his gaze drifting to the window. "It's not over yet. We've only just begun." Mitchell stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I know. But look at what you've done. Daniel's gone, the pressure's building. You're making the system answer for its own actions." Darius nodded. "That's the plan, but it won't be enough unless we keep pushing. It's not just about him, it's about everyone like him, the system, the culture, the way it protects people like him. That's what we have to change." Mitchell sat down across from him, his expression thoughtful. "But people are noticing. They're listening now. You've given them a voice." Darius looked up at his friend. "I'm just one person. The real power is in the people who've been watching, the ones who've been silent all this time. It's not just about exposing a few bad actors, it's about building a movement, getting people to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.'" Mitchell leaned forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "And that's exactly what you've done. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's been told they don't belong, for everyone who's been told their voice doesn't matter. This is bigger than you, bigger than me, and I'm with you, every step of the way." The words hung in the air for a long moment, the weight of them sinking in. Darius had spent so much of his life fighting in the shadows, working to expose the cracks in the system, without ever thinking that his actions could lead to something bigger. But now, as Mitchell spoke, he realized that everything he had fought for was starting to take shape. This wasn't just about justice for one man. It was about transforming the way society viewed power, prejudice, and accountability. And for the first time, he truly believed change was possible. The days that followed were a blur. Darius found himself thrust into the spotlight, his face appearing on the front pages of newspapers, his name in headlines across the city. He gave interviews, spoke at rallies, and met with local activists and community leaders. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it only made Darius more determined. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but with each step, he could see the foundation for a movement beginning to form. Meanwhile, Daniel's world continued to crumble. His lawyer tried to downplay the investigation, but it was clear that the tides had turned. Internal affairs found that his actions weren't just a violation of protocol, they were a violation of basic human rights. The investigation into his misconduct deepened, and soon, the public outcry became impossible to ignore. One morning, as Darius prepared for a press conference, his phone rang. It was a message from Mitchell. "Hey, you're not going to believe this," Mitchell said. "Daniels is being charged. They've found enough evidence to bring criminal charges against him." Darius's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he was speechless. This wasn't just a victory, it was a landmark moment. "They're doing it," Mitchell continued, his voice filled with excitement. "He's going to face the consequences." Darius's voice was steady, but filled with a deep sense of satisfaction. It's not just about him, it's about making sure this never happens again. As he hung up the phone, Darius felt a sense of pride he hadn't known he could feel. This wasn't just about his personal struggle anymore. This was about a system that was finally being forced to reckon with its own failures. Later that day, as Darius walked out of his office, he was greeted by the sight of a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. The news had spread, and people were waiting, their faces filled with hope and determination. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. The press conference began, and Darius stood before the cameras, a mixture of gratitude and resolve in his eyes. "Today," he began, his voice clear and strong, "we've taken one step closer to justice. Officer Daniels' actions were just the tip of the iceberg. But this isn't over. This is about holding people in power, accountable for the harm they've caused. This is about creating a future where no one has to live in fear, where no one has to suffer in silence." The applause that followed was deafening, but Darius knew that the real work was only just beginning. Over the next few months, the pressure on the police department and the city council continued to mount. Darius, along with a coalition of activists and community leaders, pushed for reform. New policies were introduced to combat racial bias in law enforcement, officers were required to undergo mandatory sensitivity training, and new protocols were put in place to ensure that all complaints of misconduct were taken seriously. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And through it all, Darius remained committed. He knew that the system would fight back. He knew that there would be those who tried to undermine the progress they had made. But for the first time, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that the world could change, that he could make a difference. As he sat at the dinner table with his family, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. His journey wasn't over, but now, he was more determined than ever to continue fighting for justice. For the voiceless, for the oppressed, for everyone who had been told their story didn't matter. And with every step, he knew he was one step closer to creating the future he had always dreamed of.